Hello everybody, this is Lisa, and in today's video, I would love to talk a little bit about garden rooms with you. So when we design a landscape, one of the things I would like to encourage you to think about is to design with rooms or outdoor spaces in mind versus thinking about individual components. And we'll keep talking about this, but I want to introduce this idea right off the bat before we dive in a little bit more. Here is a typical garden room, and three of the things that we will be discussing a lot are the ideas of garden planes. And those three planes are the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. And when we are designing garden rooms, we are always very thoughtfully and purposefully creating these outdoor spaces before we just, again, dive into a landscape design. And I feel like this concept in particular has helped a lot of people when they're approaching landscape design. Oftentimes we get caught up in buying plants and where should we put the plants? But I'd like you to take a step back. And as a designer, I'd like you to start thinking about how we're going to sculpt these outdoor spaces first, figure out the definition of them, and then we later on will buy plants and other elements to reinforce those. So again, we'll be thinking about designing the actual space first, rather than simply placing plants or any other type of garden elements, such as structures or furniture, or anything that we might place in the landscape. We want to create the room or the space first. Before we go any farther with the concept of garden rooms, I would love to discuss two important terms: spatial design and planting design. The idea of garden rooms fits well into the idea of spatial design, whereas planting design comes a little bit farther down the road in the design process. Within spatial design, we are thinking about the larger picture or the overall plan of a design. So rather than looking at the individual details, we're trying to look at the overall space. And the overall spaces in general, you might have several spaces, but we're looking at the entire picture and kind of having this broad overview of our landscape versus, again, those details within it. We might be creating lawn shapes or patios or other outdoor areas, and we're starting to define those shapes and how they relate to each other also. This process also helps us determine planting bed locations, what the beds will look like in terms of their shape. So this process is really cool because when you focus on creating the outdoor space, planting beds will eventually be revealed. So it's kind of cool. So we're not designing planting beds first, we're designing the space first, and then we use planting beds to reinforce those spaces. Whereas planting design is about organizing the plants in those beds. So we've already laid out the spaces, the garden rooms, and now we're going to start organizing the plants within those beds. With planting design, we're considering form, texture, and color. We're reinforcing the overall spaces with our plants. So plants are very important in that we are creating that backbone or that structure of those spaces because we need plants and other elements to reinforce those spaces that we're creating. And in this membership, we will be covering all aspects of planting design also, as well as spatial design. Both of these areas are, again, both very important, and they both have their processes and the different ways that you can approach each of these concepts. Here's a graphic to show you a little bit about the difference between spatial and planting design. In this landscape plan, we have a backyard, and the space on the left is a laundry yard. So we're creating that room. We also created a picnic lawn on the right with a little bench, and we have our sidewalk cutting through both of these spaces. And then we have a little reading nook. Before starting a design, it's important that we think about the different needs or functions that we want to have in our landscape, and then we make sure we create the spatial design in the outdoor spaces to accommodate those needs. And then, of course, the planting design would be the plants arrangement within the beds that are reinforcing those spaces. So it's kind of neat. It's a fun process when you go through creating those rooms. Then you can go to that next step eventually to use planting design to reinforce those rooms. Now I'd like to show you some examples of some really great spatial design. And a good spatial design, you'll see really strong forms on the ground plane in particular. And what's really important when you look at these is to think about how you are designing everything. You're designing the shape of the lawn or the patio or the beds. Everything is purposeful. Oftentimes we will design landscapes and we'll put the plants in the ground, and then whatever's left over is the lawn space. As a designer, I would like you to flip that around, and I would like you to design your beds and your lawn spaces and your patios. Everything should be designed. So this image on the right is another great example of spatial design and creating a strong room. And hopefully when you look at both of these images, what you see is that there are no leftover spaces. Everything was purposeful and thought out, from the lawn to the patio to the walks to the beds. Everything was thought through. These rooms were created, and then the plants were, and the other elements were used to reinforce those spaces. So here's just another image to show how it's really easy to create this negative or leftover space when we start putting elements down without necessarily thinking about the spaces we're creating. We go to the sale, we buy some plants, we put them here, we buy something else, we put it over there, and all of a sudden we have this awkward space. And again, what I encourage you to do is to actually design the space itself, the room, and then use all the other elements to reinforce that. So what I'm hoping you're getting from all of these images is that when we create positive and purposeful space, we have really great garden structure, and we're defining our rooms. And in the end, they are just these awesome spaces that we can use for the intended purpose that we had hoped. So what I would love to do now is show you the process that we went through with our own garden. This is a great example of how when you start a garden, you want to make sure you understand what the client would like or what they need in their outdoor space, and then how you can address them by creating outdoor rooms to fit those needs. One of the first things that we did with our own garden is I printed a Google map. I just printed it off the computer and threw some tracing paper down. I honestly did not even draw it to scale. I just did some really quick sketches to get our ideas across of where we wanted to go. And just so you know, some of the things that we thought about were, how do we want to use our outdoor space? We have a city lot. We're in Des Moines. It's a very small lot. We're not quite downtown, but we're very close, a couple of miles out. And so it's very urban. We have very large oak trees. These two circles right here are very mature oak trees. The diameter of the tree is probably 3 feet or more. And so we sat down and we together, my partner and I together, we discussed, okay, what do we want in our backyard? And we discussed having an outdoor dining area. We wanted a fire pit area. We also wanted some larger areas where we could just put containers, and then have an area where when we entertain, we would have an area where we can put tables temporarily. So we can just pop up tables or extra chairs if we need them, but they wouldn't have furniture on them all the time. And of course, we had to work around our large oak trees. So again, those two circles. So when we laid this out, we did some rough sketches, and we wanted to lay this out in a way that the fire pit was more in the back, and then we had a dining area closest to the kitchen. And in this drawing, we actually don't have the dining area, but in this image right here, we did add, while we were laying it out, we did add this area, and this ended up being our dining room area, so it could be close to the kitchen door in the back of the house. And it was all of these items and working around those oak trees, which led us to this interesting angle that's in our back of our house because we had to have the path. I did a spine right between the trees, and then we had to utilize the spaces that we had for the fire pit area and the dining area. So that's how they landed in this configuration. So this is where it started. And again, this is not to scale. We just kind of roughed it out. We are laying out the spaces first, the rooms. There are no plants on this plan. You can probably see that. I am not even thinking about individual plants. The only plants I'm considering at this point are those 2 oak trees so I can save them. And this is how I would encourage you to start any design, is to think about the functions of the room and then make sure you can accommodate those functions. And then we will do the plants later. So here we are in our backyard now. I took some photos from the second story window, and I don't know if you can see this on the right, but we physically went out there and we put stakes in the ground with string. And this is one of the oak trees, and our door's over to the bottom left of this picture. And we just strung out the walk to the back where our fire pit area will be. And we laid this out together with string and stakes. Again, not thinking about plants. I'm just laying out the space. We knew we wanted a large table, and we knew we wanted to fit at least 12 people. So we just made sure it was large enough when we laid that out. The image on the left, I drew after my partner and I laid out the landscape design in the right picture. So after we laid it all out, took us a couple of hours and we discussed a lot of things about what we wanted it to be. Then I drew this image on the left, just a really rough sketch about, what is that going to look like with the table and chairs? Is this going to be enough space? You can see the image in the back where it's more casual with a fire pit. And then I just threw some ideas of plants in there to show that I wanted to create these walls around each space and put plants in these spaces in between the rooms. So the whole idea is that I'm reinforcing the rooms I'm creating. I still don't know what plants I'm using. I just know that I want to reinforce those rooms. And in my mind, I was already thinking maybe I'll have some clipped hedges in some areas. Maybe it'll be wild in some other areas. But in general, the idea is to reinforce the rooms that we're creating. Here it is after we dug a lot of holes and put a lot of gravel down. We did all this ourselves during the pandemic summer because like many of us, a lot of us had nowhere to go and not much else to do. So we put all of our effort into this landscape. And Tommy and I, my partner, he did most of the digging. He did a lot of the lugging of the gravel, which was awesome. And we lined it with limestone. So we did all our work ourselves. And it was cool. It was cool working together. It was cool laying these spaces out. Now, hopefully what you can see is the beds, there's still not a lot of plants in them. This was the fall of that year, and my main goal was to get the hardscape down because those were the rooms. Just wanted to get the floor plane down, make sure that the rooms were there. And then we still haven't filled it all in. We're still working on that. But once you have the hardscape down or figured out and you have the rooms defined, plants can come later because the plants are there just to define the actual rooms that you're creating. In this case, there are other reasons why you have plants in your landscape, and we'll definitely talk about that in this membership. But in the most basic sense, when it comes to garden rooms, we're using plants oftentimes to reinforce the rooms. Here's a drone image of our landscape about a year after we put it in. The good news is the hardscapes are established and I know where the rooms are. And now all I've been doing is building and working on enclosing them more and more, and at least defining them. They don't always have to be enclosed per se, but I'm defining them more and more. And then here's our landscape. Again, a couple of years later, it's still not filled in. This is a little, the view of this doesn't show everything, but it looks pretty lush in this picture. It looks pretty cool. But you can see we not only have floors and walls, we have ceilings too. We have the oak trees, but then we've added lights over the dining area. And again, it's just a fun space. So I didn't go through necessarily a formal design process when I did my own yard, but I went through a process to at least define the garden rooms. And of course, it was a little bit more loosey-goosey because it was my own yard and I had the design in my brain. But when you're working with a client, you may want to go through a more formal design process to create these rooms. And the way you can create garden rooms is by using the formal design process, which we will cover in another month. So we will get to that and we will talk about that more so you can learn how to create gardens from scratch and not just from a Google map with a couple of oak trees. I'll show you how you can actually go through the more formal process. You can also use a process called lines of force, or it's also called lines of influence. And this process is about using a grid off of your house to help you determine the size and the shape of your outdoor spaces. And that's a really cool process to go through. So we will cover that also at one point so you can learn how to do that. And then, of course, you can also just do lots of concept sketches like we did to create rooms. So there's lots of different ways that you can create outdoor rooms. So you don't have to worry about that. We will talk about these different processes and then learn how to go through those. But just know that a garden room is important, and it's important to start about thinking about the spaces we're creating first and making sure we're solving the needs of the client before we start moving on to, again, the individual components like plants. So now we've created this amazing garden room. I want to show you how to reinforce it so you can add those details. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the details of floors and walls and ceilings and the different elements that you can use in those different garden planes to reinforce those rooms, and honestly to give it style and to give it so you can think about aesthetics and all those beautiful details that makes an outdoor room special. The first thing I would love to discuss is floors. And of course, you should always think about what can you use for the garden floor, but more importantly, why are you wanting to use a certain material for your garden floor? It's important to think about how you're going to use the space or how a client might use the space. Is it for dining? Does it need to be a hardscape? Is it for playing soccer? Maybe you want to use turf. Is it stepping stones because you're not going to use that area very much? So as you think about the materials for your garden floor, think about how you're using that space. So here's some examples. Here's some brick. This is a herringbone pattern. There might be a reason why you choose a certain pattern. Maybe it's more traditional versus contemporary. Maybe there's a certain color you're using because of the architecture of the house. So there's all these wonderful components that you can think about when you are adding materials. Here's some more great examples. We have a mix of brick and turf, and we have plant materials. This is recycled granite. This is at the Lori Garden in Chicago, and you can recycle materials, which is always fun. We've done a lot of that in our own garden. Here's an amazing path outside of Omaha, Nebraska. Love how irregular it is. It's not so perfect, but yet it's still perfect in many ways. It's just very beautiful. It has a lot of personality. Here's some stepping stones mixed with some beautiful plants. So when you have those textures mixing, what a great ground plane. Here's another fun pathway to a gate. Like, this is just so awesome. This is also in Nebraska. Absolutely beautiful. Great. Now this is more of a outdoor room that's connecting other rooms. Oftentimes a path can be kind of a connector room, but those can be just as special. And you can see the walls here and the floor, and then the ceiling would be the trees, but that floor is awesome. Here's a great floor in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Beautiful materials. I love the spiral that they put into it. You could just do a simple flagstone pattern, but if you have the time and the money, how fun to be able to do something unique like this. I also love when materials on the ground plane are changed. So the brick under the chairs are a different material, but I get this because that's a room off of a path. So the path itself, which goes along the room, is its own material. And then you have brick, a change of material to show that you have another room right next to the path. So it's really cool how they did this, but yet they're careful about color. The chairs are that same gray as the walkway. So it still is being held together beautifully. And this is on Martha's Vineyard. So this is a beautiful design. there. And this is in Memphis, Tennessee. Again, recycled materials, so much personality. When you can do this, it just adds so much. It's just awesome. Now let's talk about walls and what we can use for garden walls. But again, let's think about the function of the walls. When you are putting walls around a space, are they enclosed? Are they somewhat open? Are they short? Are they tall? Maybe it's just something really short on the ground plane, just enough to define that there's a room there, but you don't want to crowd everybody out. Or maybe you want complete privacy. So you need to think about those things and what kind of materials you'd like to use. Here's some examples of garden walls: fences, actual walls, trellises, plant materials, all kinds of cool things that you can use for garden walls to enclose your spaces. This is the garden in Chicago, and you can see the wall here is a fence and a gate and an arbor. Absolutely fabulous. And I don't know if you can see on the bottom along, this is a vegetable garden, and there's even smaller raised beds on the left and the right. And just having those raised beds, again, defines even that little space in the middle. This is a garden in Massachusetts, and I love that in the foreground we have a stone wall with a fence on top. But in the background, the wall is unmowed grass or unmowed meadow. And it's just a beautiful way to define the edge of a garden in a natural way. This garden is in Santa Fe, and again, a very low wall. It's made out of stone, but it defines that driveway or that parking area so well. And then you have the trees in the back, which isn't a grid. It's a bosque or a bosque. And that is a room in itself. And those trees are forming those walls within that smaller room also. This is another garden in Massachusetts. And again, clipped shrubs or trees along the right side. These are open. You can see through them, but definitely giving a different feel for this wall versus, a more wild look. I love these trees along this walkway. Again, it's forming a wall, but it's open. So this is a great example of how you can have the idea of enclosure or a wall, but it can be open and you can actually see through it. This is at the Chicago Botanic Garden. I love trellises. Whenever you are lucky enough to have a wall, you can use walls that you already have, like the side of a garage or the side of your house. Or some of you might already have, a brick wall or stone wall, and it's fun to be able to add trellises and grow vines on structures like that. And then here's another fun element at the Chicago Botanic Garden. They have this shelf on their wall, and they added plants on it. So lots of fun things that you can do with walls. You can add collections. This is in Chicago, and this is just a collection of watering cans that they had along their side of their shed. And this is in Wisconsin. And again, lots of great artifacts, old barns, and then they have these beautiful antiques everywhere to add to their walls, bright colors, and like I said, fun elements to add interest to all these planting beds. Now let's talk about ceilings. Ceilings do not need to be in all aspects or all parts of the garden. Use ceilings for special areas. So you may only use a ceiling possibly for a sitting area. Or maybe you have a dining area that needs protection from the weather. Or maybe you have an area where you want to grow vines. So there might be different reasons why you would use a ceiling. Or maybe even like at the bottom image here, this arbor, you want to have a roof so when you walk from one garden space to the other, you feel like you're going through something special. So ceilings to me are a very special thing. And they create scale also. So you can, when you have the sky as your ceiling, that's a very large, space. Whereas when you bring a ceiling down closer to you, for instance, with a pergola, that scale becomes more cozy. So ceilings are an interesting, fun element to have because it controls scale and it also tells the person visiting the garden that that's a special space. So here's different examples of ceilings. Of course, plant materials can be used for all of these. And again, this is a beautiful allée for our ceiling. And allée is when you have a path lined on either side by trees and or shrubs. This is at the Duke Botanic Gardens in North Carolina. Beautiful place. This is a sitting area in Toronto, Canada, and it's got a roof over the sitting area. Absolutely beautiful. They're protected so they can eat outside whenever they want. And then this is a beautiful canvas cover for a house in the Netherlands. This is where they park their car. What a beautiful way to add a ceiling. Umbrellas on tables. What a great way to add a ceiling. And it's a great way to bring that scale down and to give you a little bit of at least sun protection while you're eating outside. And then here's our garden again with the lights. I feel like lights are a special thing because during the daytime, you may not necessarily feel a lot of ceiling, but in the evening, it definitely brings the scale down because you see the lights instead of the sky. So it feels like the sky's lower. And again, more trees. Trees are always a special ceiling. And you can have tree canopies really high or you can have them really low. Here's a fun arbor ceiling. I think you have to duck underneath this one. In some ways, it's kind of a fun adventure in itself. And then here's another great arbor in Santa Fe. The wonderful little cloud gate that you can walk through. And again, very special way to use a ceiling. And then here's a wonderful little arbor that's in Massachusetts. Very traditional, but look how special that is. You have to walk through this very enclosed dark space to go through this into this other garden room on the other side that you get hints of. And it's a very special experience to go through. As you visit gardens, whether it's your neighbor's garden, whether it's a botanic garden, whether it's, just going through a park, take note of the garden rooms that you experience. And if you like those garden rooms, ask yourself what makes you feel comfortable in that garden room. Is it the scale? Is it the details? Is it the color? Is it the materials? And think about how you can use those similar details in your designs. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you learned a little bit about designing garden rooms and the importance of creating our outdoor spaces first before we jump into the details of other elements. And at the end here, I'll just show a little bit of video that I took at a local botanic garden so you can see some of the cool garden rooms there. Thank you so much and enjoy learning about garden rooms. This is one of my favorite spaces here. This is an amazing pergola, and it's a space on the edge of a space, which is really cool. But what I love about this is that even though it's open in the ceiling, it still feels like a ceiling. And even though it's open for the walls, it still feels defined on the edges, just perfect. And then of course the paving changes here from when you walk in from the main garden. So you're defining the space there also. And it's always feels like 10 degrees cooler in here. There's some vines growing on the arbor on top, but it's still open a lot. And it's amazing how much shade you can get in a space like this. But I just feel like this is such a great example of floors, walls, and ceilings and how impactful that can be. And I want to show you how this is the edge of another garden room, which is a lot larger than this one. But again, a great example of how rooms can bump up next to each other and even be integral to each other. I just love how these two work together. This is a great outdoor patio. And what I love about this space is that the ground plane itself changes so you know exactly where the room is. Then of course you have the wall, and there's a seating area there also. And then the wall goes around because it's also acting as a retaining wall. But it's not just a retaining wall, it's defining the sitting area with a nice cute little table and chair added to this area. It could even be cuter, but it's just a neat way to define a space by just changing the paving on the floor plane. This is a great example of a space in itself, but it's also a space that you walk through to get between spaces. This is called an allée. An allée would be a walkway that's lined with trees or shrubs on either side. And in this case, this allée is taking us from one garden behind us and then taking us to another in front. But how awesome is this space? We basically just have lawn for the ground plane and mulch, and then walls are the actual tree trunks, and then the canopy are the trees overhanging. And very simple, but it can show you how effective a strong space can be. A fence is such a great way to define a space. If you wanted to define a space quickly and put up a wall, but not a privacy wall, just a gentle reminder that that's the edge of the space, a fence does wonders for that. This whole garden is surrounded by a fence, and it's so much fun when you walk into it because you feel like you've entered something special. There's raised beds also, which actually defines the space in a different kind of way. This is an herb garden. You can do this with vegetables also. Raised beds are a great way to define and give structure even in the winter time. And there's some elevation changes in here, which is also a great way to define a space. If you have an elevation change, steps and small walls are great for that. We also have some trees right here defining the edge of the space. And then what's really cool about this space, there is a ceiling, but it's only in one location, and it's for the seating area. So again, a great example of only use ceilings where it's special. And this is a great spot for that.